In 1933, Germany was a broken nation. 10 years earlier, the frame had collapsed to the point where a wheelbarrow of bills was not enough to buy a loaf of bread. Unemployment exceeded 6 million. Factories were working at a third of their capacity. The army, the Reichswehr, was limited by the Treaty of Versailles to 100,000 men. Not a tank, not a military plane, not a submarine. And yet, just 6 years later, Adolf Hitler's armored divisions were crossing the Polish border at dawn on September 1st, 1939. 11 months later, German soldiers were parading down the Champs-Élysées. In 1941, the Reich controlled a territory that stretched from the Atlantic coasts of France to the outskirts of Moscow. How was it possible? What hidden gears, what agreements in closed rooms, what coercion on industrialists, scientists and workers made possible this leap from a ruined economy to the most feared war machine of the 20th century? That's what we're going to explore today, from within. The money in which it all started was fictitious money. On June 3, 1933, 4 months after Hitler was sworn in as Chancellor, a meeting was held that would change history. It was attended by the Minister of Defense Werner von Blomberg, Hermann Göring, the Secretary of State in the Ministry of Air Erhard Milch, and above all, Hjalmar Schacht, the man who would be the financial architect of German rearmament. The figure agreed upon that day was 35,000 million Reichsmarks, to be spent over 8 years at a rate of almost 4,400 million per year. To understand the magnitude, Germany's total national income in 1933 had fallen to a mere 43 billion Reichsmarks. Schacht was proposing that between 5 and 10% of the country's gross domestic product be spent on defense for almost a decade in a nation with a per capita income that in current terms would resemble that of Iran or South Africa in those years. The United States and Britain only reached that level of military spending during the most intense phases of the Cold War, supported by incomparably wealthier economies. The problem was obvious. Raising even the first tranche of those 35,000 million through taxes or conventional debt was impossible given the state of the German financial markets. Schacht had to invent money. What he invented was the Mefo-Wechsel, the letter Mefo. The Metallurgische Forschungsgesellschaft MBH, Mefo, Metallurgical Research Society, was created with a nominal capital of just 1 million Reichsmarks, contributed by 5 companies: Vereinigte Stahlwerke, Krupp, Siemens, Deutsche Industriewerke, and Gute Hoffnungshütte. The last 2 were direct producers of weapons. Siemens and Vereinigte Stahlwerke, although beneficiaries of military spending, were included mainly because of their credit rating. Mefo was, in practical terms, a shell company. Its function was to issue promissory notes on behalf of the rearmament contractors. Contractors received these promissory notes as payment for their military supplies, and they could discount them at the Reichsbank at a small discount. Since the papers paid good interest and were implicitly guaranteed by the state, most circulated without being liquidated. The result was a system of off-budget financing, invisible to foreign markets, with which the government hid for years the real extent of rearmament from the eyes of France, Britain, and the United States. In the autumn of 1933, limited issuance for the first Luftwaffe contractors began. In April 1934, the large-scale disbursement began. By 1936, the machinery was in motion, and secrecy was hard to keep. But there is one thing that should be clear before continuing. In December 1931, while Schacht was still preparing the basis for rearmament, the Reichswehr General Staff had approved the so-called Rüstungsplan, the Rearmament Plan, which called for just 480 million Reichsmarks over 5 years to provide Germany with 21 defense divisions equipped with artillery, tanks and planes. A modest plan, technically within the limits of the Treaty of Versailles. The Umbau Plan of November 1932, authorized by General Kurt von Schleicher, was more ambitious. It envisaged a standing army of 21 divisions built around a core of 147,000 professional soldiers. What Hitler ordered in June 1933 shattered all those limits. The agreed military expenditure was almost 3 times greater than the total civilian job creation measures passed in 1932 and 1933. The program of public works, including the Autobahnen, was, in terms of actual volume, a cosmetic operation compared to what was happening in the barracks, shipyards and hangars. There is an image that the Nazis worked with great care, that of Hitler with the first shovel on the ground in Frankfurt-Darmstadt on September 23, 1933, inaugurating the works of the first Autobahn. News cameras recorded that the Führer not only removed the earth but filled an entire wheelbarrow. It was one of the most photographed moments of that year. Fritz Todt had convinced Hitler with an argument that mixed economics and strategy. He calculated that with an annual budget of 1 billion Reichsmarks, it could employ 600,000 workers, especially if the use of machinery was limited as much as possible, and that its highways would allow 300,000 troops to be moved from the eastern to the western frontier in 2 nights of intense driving. That army of 300,000 men was 3 times the limit imposed by Versailles. Todt was not a road builder thinking about freight trucks. He was a military engineer disguised as an urban planner. Unemployment fell from more than 6 million in January 1933 to about 4 million in just 6 months. This decline was real, but its causes were very complex. Rearmament, army contracts, the compulsory labor service, the expulsion of married women from the labor market, the statistical erasure of certain categories of unemployed. The battle for work, as Goebbels' propaganda called it, was rather more theatrical than Keynesian economic policy. Unemployment had begun to fall even before Hitler took power, following a trend that was already visible at the end of 1932. What the regime did was to appropriate the moment and magnify it until it became a symbol of national rebirth. But the real effect of the Autobahnen on unemployment was marginal. In 1933, no more than 1,000 workers were on the first works. 12 months after Todt's appointment as Inspector General of German roads, the number amounted to barely 38,000 workers, a tiny fraction. What the propaganda presented as the symbol of the German Renaissance was, from an economic point of view, almost irrelevant. The real funds, the substantive decisions, flowed elsewhere, to the barracks, the test grounds, the shipyards and the armament workshops. According to data collected by Adam Tooze in The Wages of Destruction, the military work program agreed in June 1933 was almost 3 times larger than the total civilian job creation measures of 1932 and 1933 combined. And then there was the question of the workers themselves. An article in the Deutsche Medizinische Wochenschrift on November 6, 1936, documented something that the newsreels never showed: an unusually high rate of herniated discs among highway construction workers. Piecework workers, competing to maximize their hourly performance in days of up to 10 hours with a short lunch break, systematically injured their spine. They were the real conditions behind the heroic image of the German worker building the roads of the future. With the funds from the Autobahn funneled and propaganda doing its job, Todt built an organization that in wartime would be the largest construction machinery in Europe. His crews, many of them forced laborers during the conflict, erected bunkers on the Atlantic Wall, industrial facilities buried underground in the Alps, military bridges on the Eastern Front and machine gun nests from Norway to North Africa. The Autobahn was the laboratory. The war was the real project. On October 17, 1933, very early in the morning, government agents arrested Dr. Hugo Junkers at his vacation home in Bayrischzell in the Bavarian Alps on charges of treason. Junkers was the pioneer of German aviation, the engineer who had built the world's first integral metal aircraft at his factory in Dessau. Their plant was by far the largest aviation factory in Germany. After 24 hours in police custody, Junkers, now an old man in broken health, signed the assignment of his company to the Reich. Control was handed over to Heinrich Koppenberg, a veteran of the Flick conglomerate with experience in the World War I arms industry. From that moment on, the Dessau factory became the productive heart of the new German air power. What Hermann Göring and his State Secretary Erhard Milch were building was unique. The German aeronautical companies, Arado, Heinkel, Dornier, Focke-Wulf, and Bayerische Flugzeugwerke, commercially known as Messerschmitt, were nominally private, but in practice they were creatures of the Reich Air Ministry. They had no alternative civilian production. The military aircraft they manufactured in the late 1930s had no value as commercial products. All the installed capacity, all the engineers, all the specialized workshops depended absolutely on the state contract. It was an industry that could not survive without war. In the ranking of the 100 largest German private companies in the late 1930s, Junkers, before its most dramatic expansion phase, was already in 12th place alongside Daimler-Benz, whose position on the list was largely due to the expansion of its aircraft engines. BMW was in a similar situation. Siemens and AEG supplied electronic subcomponents to the Luftwaffe through their joint subsidiary Telefunken. Aluminium and magnesium came from Vereinigte Aluminiumwerke and IG Farben. The high-quality steel came from Roland's Deutsche Edelstahlwerke and Krupp. Daimler-Benz and ITT Lawrence, Bosch, Henschel and Blohm and Voss were all in. It was an industrial ecosystem that the state had created out of thin air in less than a decade, enveloping existing large corporations in a web of contracts, incentives, and, when necessary, coercion. By 1938, 6 specialist aeronautical companies were among the 100 largest private employers in Germany. None of them would have even appeared among the 500 largest in 1933. Without fuel, the tanks are rusty iron. Without gasoline, airplanes are aluminum tubes on rubber wheels. Germany had no oil. It had coal. Huge quantities of coal in the Ruhr area and in Silesia, but virtually no crude oil deposits. In modern motorized warfare, that was a strategic death sentence. The solution had been developed by the chemists at IG Farben since the 1920s. At its Leuna facility near Merseburg, in the industrial belt of central Germany, the company had begun construction in 1928 of the world's first plant for coal hydrogenation, the alchemical process by which coal is converted into gasoline. The investment was 330 million Reichsmarks. Karl Bosch, the director of IG Farben, bet on this technology, convinced that the world's oil would soon run out. The gamble went wrong. In October 1930, drillers in East Texas discovered the famous Black Giant, the largest oil field ever found. The world price of crude oil sank. The Leuna plant was left without economic justification. But for Hitler, Leuna's investment was exactly what he needed. In August 1933, Secretary of State Milch told Karl Krausch, the technical manager of IG Farben's synthetics program, that the Air Ministry was ready to discuss the future of the fuel supply. 2 days later, the Reich Ministry of Economics sent a letter that made things clear. For us National Socialists, in addition to economic criteria, military reasons are decisive. I am therefore determined to promote the production of fuel from German raw materials by all possible means. IG Farben produced 1.78 million tons of synthetic fuel in 1936. But German consumption was growing at the same rate as production, so dependence did not disappear. What did expand was the industrial capacity, the Buna plant for the production of synthetic rubber essential for the tires of all motor vehicles. By the late 1930s, Germany had the technology to manufacture both the fuel and rubber for its mechanized armies without relying on imports. It was an imperfect, fragile, expensive autarky. Producing synthetic oil cost almost 4 times more than imported oil at market prices, but it was the only possible alternative. The fourth four-year plan, which Göring presented in October 1936 with full powers to direct the German economy, allocated millions of dollars in investments to this sector. The calculations most accepted by historians indicate that the four-year plan allocated resources equivalent to between 8,600 and 9,500 million Reichsmarks per year to the priority sectors: mineral oil, Buna rubber, chemicals, non-ferrous metals, iron and steel. In August 1936, Adolf Hitler personally drafted a secret memorandum that circulated only to a handful of people. His conclusion was stark. Germany was 4 years away from a war that he considered inevitable. The economy and the army had to be ready for combat in that time frame. Anyone who stood in the way, including businessmen who prioritized profitability over rearmament, would be treated as an enemy of the state. The 4-year plan made Göring the top coordinator of the German economy, above Hjalmar Schacht himself, who saw his influence erode until he resigned as Minister of Economy in 1937. Schacht had financed rearmament, but it had limits. He was worried about inflation, the flight of foreign currency, the trade imbalance. Göring had none of these scruples. On October 18, 1936, Hitler formally gave him authorization as plenipotentiary general of the 4-year plan, with specific decrees giving him responsibility for virtually every aspect of economic policy, including control of the corporate media. Schacht nominally remained as Minister of Economics and President of the Reichsbank, but those within the system already knew that he had lost. From December 5, 1936, Göring chaired meetings of the armed forces in which he announced that he would henceforth be in control of military finances. Raw materials and labor, he declared, would dictate the pace of German military expansion, not money. It was a statement that in practice meant that budget limits had ceased to exist as a real constraint. And on December 17, 1936, at the Preußenhaus in Berlin, before the leading industrialists of the Reich, Göring explained it without euphemisms. He reminded them of the devastating effect of the blockade on World War I and the enormous mobilization of which Germany had proved capable. He reminded them that before 1914, people were anxiously talking about spending a few billion on defense, and that the war had cost 160 billion marks. Now, he told them, the businessmen who blocked rearmament were saboteurs, and the saboteurs of the mobilization would be dealt with accordingly. What forced Göring's hand in the steel affair was a deficit that could not be hidden. In January 1937, German iron ore reserves covered barely a month of production. The solution that Göring imposed, against the fiery resistance of the private steel industry in the Ruhr, was the creation of the Reichswerke Hermann Göring. On July 15, 1937, Paul Pleyger signed the statutes of that public company with an initial capital of 5 million Reichsmarks subscribed by the Reich. In Salzgitter, American engineer H.A. Brazett designed a state-of-the-art integrated steel mill with an initial capacity of 1 million tons per year, with plans to expand it to 4 million tons, a figure that would rival Vestig itself, Germany's largest private steel mill. A week later, on July 23rd, Göring invited 300 representatives of the German steel industry to a dinner at the Air Ministry. The 6 leaders of the main companies were summoned to a private meeting beforehand. Göring appeared in full uniform, surrounded by a large entourage of officers. His tone was aggressive and prepared. The industry had failed the state by not developing the national iron ore deposits. Hitler had given it 4 years, and they had wasted that time. Göring had lost his patience. His job, he declared, was to sink the saboteurs of rearmament and the 4-year plan and send them where they deserved to be. Industrialists were given maps of their company's iron ore deposits that were to be expropriated on behalf of the new Reichswerke. The decree had been personally approved by Hitler. The industry tried to resist. Ernst Pönsgen, managing director of Vestig, mobilized the large producers in a common opposition position with the support of Schacht. His arguments were technical and sound. Germany did not need another new steel mill complete with smelting and rolling mills, but simply access to existing ore. Spending 200 million Reichsmarks on new facilities in Salzgitter would create overcapacity, raise costs, and create chaos in the network of international cartels that regulated the European steel trade. But Pleyger and Göring already had the police apparatus of the state. Eventually, the industry relented. The Reichswerke became much larger than a steel mill during the war. They expanded to include mining, shipbuilding, mechanical engineering, and aluminum production facilities in the occupied territories of Western, Eastern, and Southeastern Europe. By 1941, the Reichswerke Hermann Göring was the largest industrial enterprise in Europe and one of the largest in the world, with tens of thousands of employees, many of them forced laborers. Meanwhile, the structure of the four-year plan generated its own control bureaucracy. The investments planned during the years 1937 to 1939 in the priority sectors were distributed as follows, according to the data compiled by Dietmar Petziner in his canonical study on the policy of autarky of the Third Reich: mineral oil, 1,438 to 2,684 million Reichsmarks, depending on the year. Buna rubber, between 517 and 654 million. Miscellaneous chemicals, between 2,351 and 778 million. The variation in these figures between years reflects the continuous adjustments of priorities that characterized a system where economic policy was always subsidiary to military strategy. There is one date that marks the limit of discretion, January 27, 1939, when Admiral Erich Raeder presented Plan Z to Hitler, the last and most ambitious of the pre-war rearmament schedules, and was given absolute priority over all other industrial projects of the Reich. Plan Z was a strategic fantasy and a logistical nightmare at the same time. He planned the construction of 6 H-type battleships, giants of 56,000 tons, larger than the Bismarck, 2 aircraft carriers, several heavy and light cruisers, 68 destroyers instead of the 12 allowed by the Treaty of Versailles, and 249 submarines instead of the 0 that Versailles authorized. The full fleet would not be ready before 1949, but the expenditure had to begin immediately, and from the second half of 1934, large orders were already being placed in the shipyards of northern Germany. The war came before Plan Z could materialize. When Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, the Kriegsmarine had only 57 submarines, of which only 32 were capable of operating in the Atlantic. Plan Z was cancelled in the first weeks of the conflict. The priorities of the land war left no room for battleships with a 10-year construction deadline. Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the submarines and a staunch National Socialist, had calculated that in order to break Britain, his crews would need to sink at least 600,000 tons of ships per month for a minimum of 1 year. To achieve this, he estimated that at least 300 U-boats were necessary, enough to maintain 100 operations simultaneously in the North Atlantic. In October 1939, Raeder presented Hitler with the plan to build 658 submarines that would theoretically allow that goal to be achieved by the end of 1942. The cost of each U-boat ranged from 2 to 4 million Reichsmarks, compared to more than 200 million for a Bismarck-class battleship. A U-boat was 100 times cheaper, but submarines consumed copper and rubber in disproportionate proportions, 2 materials that were already in short supply in the first winter of war, and the concrete facilities needed to house a fleet of hundreds of units represented a construction challenge that the priority of the Army and the Luftwaffe postponed indefinitely. The result, between September 1939 and June 1940, only 20 new U-boats were built. Continuing losses reduced the operating number in the Atlantic to a mere 25 by the summer of 1940. With that ridiculous force, Dönitz managed to sink almost 680,000 tons of British ships until March 1940. A real but insufficient blow. Britain had 18 million tons of its own ships and could rent or charter several million more, while its shipyards produced more than 1 million new tons each year. In July 1940, Hitler briefly assigned top priority to the U-boat program, reallocating tens of thousands of tons of steel from munitions production to the naval sector. Production targets went up to 25 submarines per month, but the naval bonanza did not last. By the autumn of 1940, the priority had returned to the Army, and actual deliveries between June 1940 and March 1941 were only 72 units, most needed for training. The number of operational U-boats in the Atlantic fell to a low of 22 in February 1941. With that minuscule strength, but with growing experience and a share of good fortune, Dönitz sank more than 2 million tons of British ships between June 1940 and March 1941, in what German crews would later call the happy times, die glückliche Zeit. But the time factor was what definitely played against the U-boat strategy. In the optimistic summer of 1940, Dönitz calculated that with a full fleet he could complete Britain's isolation by the autumn of 1941. After that, it would take several more months to strangle the food supply, and that rhythm was not what Hitler needed. He sought to decide the war in a much shorter horizon. Every month that passed without resolving the conflict with Britain was a month that the United States had to arm itself and prepare to intervene. And there was another problem that admirals couldn't solve by designing better U-boats, the Enigma Code. The decipherments of the British intelligence service, the Bletchley Park, made it possible to redirect the convoys to avoid Dönitz's wolf formations, Rudel, with a frequency that the Germans never fully understood. Between the spring and summer of 1941, before the United States intervened decisively in the naval war, British ship losses fell below 100,000 tons per month. That was a far cry from the 600,000 Dönitz needed. While the Navy struggled for resources, the Luftwaffe built an industry from scratch. Junkers, Heinkel, Dornier, Focke-Wulf and Messerschmitt, the Bayerische Flugzeugwerke, were nominally private companies. The reality was different. They were all creatures of the Reich Air Ministry, led by Erhard Milch with almost unlimited powers over the sector. The German aircraft industry had no alternative civilian production. It could not exist without the war that was being prepared. Daimler-Benz and BMW, known for their cars and motorcycles, owed their position among the country's largest private employers almost exclusively to the expansion of their aircraft engines. The supply chain was complete. Siemens and AEG with electronics, ITT Lawrence and Bosch with radio and telecommunications components, Vereinigte Aluminiumwerke with the lightweight aluminium needed for the airframes, Krupp and Deutsche Edelstahlwerke with the precision steel for the engines. What the regime had created was a state industry disguised as private capitalism, and when an industrialist resisted, like Junkers in 1933, the consequences were immediate and beyond appeal. In September 1935, new German fighters and bombers paraded publicly for the first time at the Nuremberg Party Congress, revealing to the world that the Luftwaffe was already a real force. By 1938, the 6 major specialized aviation producers that did not exist in 1933 occupied 6 of the top 100 positions in the ranking of German private employers. Below the Luftwaffe and the Kriegsmarine, the army was the most voracious consumer of the war economy. Germany's structural problem was steel. The needs of the 4-year plan, minerals, chemicals, shipbuilding, land weapons, were constantly competing for the same scarce resource. In 1937, during the period when Schacht was still trying to balance exports with the needs for rearmament, the monthly steel quota allocated to the export sector was set at 505,000 tons, almost as much as the Wehrmacht and the 4-year plan combined. A special committee was to coordinate military needs with the absolute priority of exports, and Vestag's general manager, Ernst Pönsgen, was tasked with finding foreign markets for an additional 100,000 tons per month. It was the time when the German war economy was still trying to maintain the fiction that foreign trade could coexist with massive rearmament. But on the high-quality steel front, the story was different. Although total full-capacity crude steel production in Germany was barely half that of the United States, in specialty electrical steel, the type needed for armor, guns and aircraft engines, Germany was roughly on par with the Americans in 1939. Credit went to men like Julius Borbet, director of the Bochumer Verein, who had developed the centrifugal casting process, a revolutionary technique in which cannons were obtained by spinning molten metal instead of drilling solid blocks of steel, and Walter Roland, who would be known during the war as Roland the Panzer, who in the First World War had fought in Verdun and in the occupation of the Ruhr in 1923, and that when Hitler declared open rearmament in 1935, he immediately joined the 11th Panzer Regiment as a reserve captain. Between 1929 and 1939, German production of specialty electrical steel increased sevenfold. It was the raw material from which the new armoured vehicles were made. The actual state of the German armoured force was, however, more fragile than the propaganda presented. The Panzer I and II that made the Polish campaign were light machines, designed more for training than for tank combat. The Panzer I mounted only machine guns, the II a 20mm gun. The most capable models, the Panzer III with its 37mm gun and the Panzer IV with its short 75mm gun, were the ones that carried the weight of real combat, but they were in the minority. In the days leading up to the French campaign of May 1940, the German army had about 2,500 tanks in total, of which just over 600 were Panzer III or IV. The rest were light models or tank destroyers. The victory over France was won with doctrine, speed and audacity, not with technological superiority in armour. The production chain of a tank during the 30s and early 40s involved a network of subcontractors that made coordination very difficult. Henschel in Kassel manufactured the chassis. Mann in Nuremberg and Daimler-Benz at various sites provided key components. Krupp in Essen was the supplier of the turrets and the main armoured steel. Bottlenecks in that chain, a delay in ball bearings, a shortage of armoured sheet metal, an electrical wiring supplier's outage, could bring the entire line to a halt. In 1932, the German aircraft industry employed 3,200 people and had the capacity to produce just 100 aircraft a year. Less than 10 years later, that sector employed at least 250,000 people and produced more than 10,000 fighter jets annually. The growth of the tank industry was equally dizzying, but more bumpy. The Reichsbahn, the national railways, acted as the unwitting arbiter of the war economy. Every train that transported iron ore to the blast furnaces was a train that did not carry ammunition in front. Every coal wagon to the synthetic fuel plants in Leuna, Hydrierwerk Pöllitz, or the IG Farben facility in Ludwigshafen was a resource that did not reach the artillery manufacturing sites. The bottlenecks in the railway network are reflected in the sources of the period under the term Engpass Reichsbahn. The saturation of the network was already visible in the analyses of the Ministry of Economics in 1938 and 1939, even before the war began, and would worsen exponentially when the Eastern Front extended to more than 2,000 kilometers in length. Artillery production followed its own cycle of crisis and adaptation. The Wehrmacht's heavy artillery pieces, the 88mm gun that proved to be the German army's most versatile piece, effective against both armor and aircraft, came from Krupp. The production of 88mm ammunition became one of the most direct indicators of the health of the war industrial system, and its fluctuation, visible in the archives of the Rüstungsamt, accurately records the moments of steel, coal or labor shortages that shook the war economy. When Fritz Todt took office as Minister of Armaments on March 17, 1940, he inherited a chaotic system. The different branches of the armed forces, Wehrmacht, Luftwaffe, Kriegsmarine, competed with each other for the same resources without effective coordination. Each made its own orders of industries, creating duplications, artificial shortages, and resource-consuming disorganization that the war economy could not afford. Todt introduced the concept of Ausschüsse, committees, and Ringe, industrial coordination rings, bringing together manufacturers in the same sector to standardize components, reduce variance, and increase production through specialization. The result was a modest but real improvement in the efficiency of the ground armaments sector between 1940 and 1941. But Todt died before he saw the results of his reform. On the 8th of February 1942, his Heinkel. He-111 aircraft took off from the Führer's headquarters at Rastenburg in East Prussia in adverse weather conditions and crashed within minutes of takeoff. The exact circumstances of the accident were never fully clarified. He was 50 years old. Albert Speer received a call he didn't expect. Albert Speer was born in 1905 in Mannheim into a family of the upper bourgeoisie. His father was an architect. So did his grandfather. When he attended Hitler's speech in Berlin for the first time in 1931, the city gave the Führer only 22.5% of the vote in the last free elections in November 1932. Speer was fascinated. He was 26 years old, had no solid political convictions, and what Hitler Albert Speer received a call he did not expect. Speer was born in 1905 in Mannheim into a family of the upper bourgeoisie. His father was an architect. So did his grandfather. When he attended Hitler's speech in Berlin for the first time in 1931, the city gave the Führer only 22.5% of the vote in the last free elections in November 1932. Speer was fascinated. He was 26 years old, had no solid political convictions, and what Hitler offered him was the promise of building monuments capable of challenging those of the ancient world. He joined the Nazi Party in January 1931. Not out of ideological fervor, but for the same reason as many young people of his generation. Hitler promised action, scale, greatness. In 1942, Speer was neither an economist nor a general. He was Hitler's favorite architect, the man who had designed the Reich Chancellery, the tribunes of Nuremberg, the plans of the Berlin that Hitler wanted to rename Germania. That same February 8, 1942, the day Fritz Todt died in the accident of his Heinkel He 111, Hitler summoned him and offered him the ministry. Speer was 36 years old. What he found when he arrived at the Ministry of Armaments was a dysfunctional organism caught between the state bureaucracy, the interests of the party, and the contradictory demands of the three branches of the armed forces. The ministry itself had only 218 officials in Berlin. But the industrial organization that Speer built above him, the so-called industrial organization, industry organization, came to incorporate more than 10,000 external collaborators and consultants. It was a deliberate structure. Speer wanted the ministry to be a lead agency, not a bureaucratic chain of command that tried to directly manage millions of production decisions. His first reform was radical, eliminating the figure of the General Staff as a filter between the minister and the operational bodies. In the previous system, almost all matters went through the Secretary of State, who acted as a discretionary sieve. Speer abolished it and placed directly in charge of more than 30 leaders of the industrial organization and no less than 10 heads of departments in the ministry itself. All of them were authorized to sign orders by delegation from the minister. A technical break with the rules of the state bureaucracy, because that capacity was normally reserved for secretaries of state. The Minister of the Interior formally protested. Speer ignored the protest. The central concept was the Industrielle Selbstverantwortung, autonomous industrial responsibility. Instead of ministerial officials dictating what and how to produce, the most capable industrialists in each sector themselves assumed the operational direction of production. Walter Roland the Panzer, the man who had fought at Verdun and knew the inside of armor, chaired the main tank committee. Hans Kerl, who had built his reputation as a crisis manager in the textile industry, coordinated the raw materials system. Karl Sauer, a party man with industrial experience, ran the technical department with a harshness that made him feared even by his own subordinates. The Zentrale Planung, central planning, was the most important institutional innovation. It was created as the governing body for the priorities of the entire war economy, chaired by Speer with the participation of the Air Ministry, represented by Field Marshal Milch, and finance. Prior to its creation, Göring had personally managed these priorities until about 1939. Then, with no one with enough authority to handle increasingly complex problems, the system had fragmented into rivalries between ministries. The Zentrale Planung brought together ministers, secretaries of state and their experts in the same room to fight for their quotas of steel, coal and labor in sessions that lasted for hours and produced results in concrete terms of resource allocation. Speer wrote it accurately in his memoirs. It was incomprehensible that such a central body had not been established much earlier to direct programs and priorities. The reality was that Hitler's Reich structured as a permanent competition between fiefdoms of power, was inherently hostile to centralized coordination. Speer managed to impose it for a period, but only because Hitler protected him, and only while the results in the form of increasing production gave him arguments to resist the maneuvers of Bormann, Goebbels, Göring and Sauckel himself, who were trying to curtail his influence. The increase in production that followed was measurable. In Speer's first year as minister, ammunition production increased by 97%. Tank prices rose 25%. That of artillery pieces, 27%. But when Speer tried to cut off the production of consumer goods, which in January 1942 was still operating just 3% below the peacetime level, he was met with unexpected resistance. It achieved a 12% reduction before Hitler, in June 1942, ordered the resumption of the manufacture of products for the general consumption of the population. The propaganda of the Volksgemeinschaft, the community of the people, clashed with the needs of the war economy in ways that no decree could resolve without political costs that the regime was not prepared to assume. On January 22, 1943, while in Stalingrad the last soldiers of the Southern Army were beginning to understand that there was no possible rescue, Hitler signed the decree that launched the Adolf Hitler Panzer program. The Ostheer, the German army on the Eastern Front, had been reduced to just 495 operational panzers in the last days of January 1943, not all of them in combat condition. The magnitude of the problem was visible even to those who did not want to see it. The decree was drastic in its language. Immediately increasing tank production was of such decisive importance to the outcome of the war that all civilian and military agencies had to support the program with all available resources, even if it meant temporarily harming other important programs of the arms economy. Tank factory workers were exempt from army call-ups, and all those who had been drafted since December 18, 1942, were to be returned to their posts. Anyone who does not cooperate could end up before the Volksgerichtshof, the People's Court. Factories were allowed to switch to 72-hour work weeks. Henschel's plant in Kassel, producer of the Tiger, the 57-ton heavy wagon that was beginning to arrive at the front, worked in 2 12-hour shifts non-stop from the autumn of 1942. Some workers, swept away by the enthusiasm of the moment or by fear, came to work 24 consecutive hour shifts. In exchange, they received extra rations of food, vitamin pills, and a special ration of clothing. A holiday resort in Tyrol was reserved for your families. Propaganda accompanied the program with Speer and General Heinz Guderian, the new Inspector General of Armour, appearing on the newscasts, shaking hands with workers from the tank factories. The result was real. The number of tanks produced in May 1943 was significantly higher than in May 1942. The new models, the Panther and the Tiger, arrived at the front. The Nibelungenwerk in St. Valentin, near Linz, became one of the major centres of armoured production. But the quality of the new models was accompanied by chronic mechanical problems. The Panther's engine was initially unreliable, and the Tiger's 57 tons placed extreme demands on the Army's bridges, roads and transportation systems. Behind the production figures were millions of people who had not chosen to be there. Fritz Sauckel, Gauleiter of Thuringia and one of the most radical of the party's leaders, was appointed in March 1942 Generalbevollmächtigter für den Arbeitseinsatz, General Plenipotentiary for Employment of Labour. Their mission was simple on paper: to provide the German war economy with all the manpower it needed, where needed and as possible. Sauckel's methods were those of organized abduction. Its agents roamed the occupied areas of Eastern Europe, Poland, Ukraine, Belarus, the Baltics, recruiting workers with promises that were rarely fulfilled and with coercion when promises were not enough. Those who arrived in Germany as Ostarbeiter, workers from the East, were required to wear a patch with the letters OST on their clothing, lived in camps separate from the German population, received lower rations than any other worker, and were subject to barracks discipline. By the summer of 1942, thousands of new workers were arriving at the large industrial centres every day. The cities did not have the capacity to house or feed them. Conditions varied, but in many heavy industrial areas the situation was, according to the regime's own internal reports, catastrophic. In December 1942, an inspection commission from the Ostministerium visited the Ostarbeiter camps in the Ruhr and found in the camp, operated by the Bochumer Verein, part of the Vestag Consortium, what they described as an image of desolation and immiseration that will never be erased. The report was archived. Between April and July 1942, the number of Soviet workers fleeing the camps increased from 2,059 to 22,603 recorded escapes. In August 1942, the Gestapo estimated that it would have to handle another 30,000 escape cases in the following months. The slave labor economy had its own accounting. By the middle of the war, the Reich housed millions of forced laborers on its territory and in the occupied territories. Soviet prisoners of war, civilian workers from the occupied countries of Western Europe, concentration camp prisoners ceded to industry. Through agreements with the SS IG Farben built its own Buna synthetic rubber plant next to the Auschwitz camp, where prisoners worked to death literally at the site of the crematorium's chimneys. Speer, in his memoirs published in 1969, acknowledged that he was aware of the existence of concentration camp labor and that negotiations with Sauckel for the supply of forced labor were part of his ministerial work. Before the Nuremberg tribunal, he was sentenced to 20 years in prison precisely for crimes related to slave labor. Ernst Kaltenbrunner, the head of the Gestapo, went so far as to want to prosecute 3 company CEOs: Bucher of AEG, Vögler of United Steel Works, and Reusch of Gute Hoffnungshütte, for defeatist conversations, but Speer protected them by arguing that the nature of their work required frank talk about the situation. On the 17th of May 1943, 19 Lancaster bombers from 617 Squadron RAF attacked the Ruhr dams with special ricochet bombs designed by Barnes-Wallis. The Möhne Dam was destroyed. The released water flooded the Ruhr Valley, flooded the electrical installations of pumping stations, and disrupted the water supply and industry in the region. Speer arrived at dawn, flying over the area before landing. What he saw disturbed him deeply. In his report to Hitler, he described a situation of extreme gravity. Hitler read it and retained it. But the RAF did not destroy the other 3 target dams, and Todt organization crews repaired the damage in record time. On September 20, 1942, Speer had warned Hitler that the tank production facilities in Friedrichshafen and the ball-bearing factories in Schweinfurt were critical points of the entire war economy. 2 or 3 coordinated and sustained attacks on these nerve centers could have fundamentally altered the course of German production. The Allies attacked Schweinfurt in August and October 1943, causing heavy damage. However, they did not bombard the workshops again with the same intensity during the critical period when bearing reserves were minimal, allowing the industry to recover and disperse production. Speer later wrote that the war could have been largely decided in 1943 if, instead of massive area bombing, the Allies had concentrated their efforts on the nerve centers of weapons production. That assessment is from a man with an obvious interest in mitigating his own responsibility, but historians, including Richard Overy, have concluded that he was essentially right. What the bombings did achieve, systematically and devastatingly from 1944 onwards, was to attack the synthetic fuel plants. Beginning in the spring of 1944, Allied attacks on coal-burning hydrogenation facilities, the plants that produced 90% of German aviation fuel, began to have effects that no industrial reorganization could compensate. Luftwaffe planes began to be grounded due to lack of gasoline. The tanks could not move. The German war industry, which had reached its peak of production in the summer of 1944, began to collapse, not because of a lack of steel, but because of a lack of energy to move it and fuel to use it. On an afternoon in June 1942, the 13th to be exact, a four-story rocket rose above a clearing among the pines of the island of Usedom on the Baltic coast, with a roar that witnesses described as that of an unchained giant. Colonel Walter Dornberger, Engineer Werner von Braun and their team watched with a mixture of expectation and terror. Field Marshal Milch, Admiral Witzel, General Fromm and Albert Speer were present. The rocket rose, hesitated, climbed into the low clouds. A minute and a half later, the sound that returned was that of its impact on the ground less than a kilometer from the launch point. The guidance system had failed, but the technicians were satisfied. The most difficult thing, getting the device out of the ground, worked. Speer was, in his own words, stunned by this technical miracle. On October 14, 1942, he was able to inform Hitler that the Führer's doubts could be considered overcome. The second rocket had traveled the planned 190 kilometers and fell less than 4 kilometers from the target. The weapon he saw that day was the A4, which would be publicly christened the Vergeltungswaffe II, the No. 2 retaliatory weapon, the V2. It measured 14 meters in length, weighed more than 13 metric tons, and could carry a warhead of approximately 1 ton of explosives more than 300 kilometers away, traveling at speeds that made it invisible and undetectable to Allied radars. Hitler wanted to produce 900 units per month. Speer, in his memoirs, acknowledged that supporting that program was one of his most serious mistakes. In 1944, Allied bombers dropped an average of 3,000 tons of bombs a day for months. The 900 V2s a month would have delivered some 24 tons of explosives to English territory each day, the equivalent of the load of just 12 flying fortresses. The opportunity cost was enormous. Peenemünde had 2,210 scientists and engineers working on the A4 and A9 long-range rockets on January 1, 1945. The Waterfall project, Wasserfall, a surface-to-air rocket designed to shoot down Allied bombers, had only 220 technicians assigned. The Typhoon project, another anti-aircraft rocket system, had 135. Had those resources been concentrated on air defense, the damage that the B-17 and Lancasters could inflict on the German economy would have been incomparably less. To manufacture the V2 rockets on a large scale, the Reich resorted to caves. The Mittelwerk complex, excavated in the Harz Mountains near Nordhausen in Thuringia, used prisoners from the Mittelbau-Dora concentration camp to build and operate the assembly lines underground. The conditions were deadly. Prisoners worked, slept and died in the tunnels. The production line produced about 600 V2 rockets per month at the end of the war. A total of just over 3,000 V2s were launched against London, Antwerp, and other cities, killing approximately 9,000 people and injuring twice as many. The number of forced laborers who died in the construction and operation of the Mittelwerk is estimated to be in the thousands. In the summer of 1944, the German war economy reached its highest point. The production of tanks, aircraft, artillery and ammunition was greater than at any previous time in the conflict. Speer had been rationalizing, concentrating, pressuring industries for 2 years to get more out of less. The numbers were impressive, and they were completely insufficient. In July 1944, 2,305 fighter aircraft were produced. In December, 2,352. Despite Hitler's order to cut fighter production in half, the numbers remained stable. But planes couldn't take off without fuel, and the fuel was running out at a rate that no statistical chart could disguise. At the same time, chromium, essential for making heat-resistant steel, which is essential in aircraft engines, became alarmingly scarce in late 1944. Without chrome from Turkey or from the mines of the occupied territories, which were being liberated by the Allied armies, the engine production line was doomed. Speer documented this in memos he sent to Hitler that accurately described the number of weeks remaining before the lack of chromium crippled the manufacture of aircraft engines. On January 27, 1945, exactly 12 years after Hitler took power, Speer sent the Führer a memorandum concluding that the war on the heavy industry and armaments front was lost, It called for priority to be given to food, domestic heating and electricity, over tanks, aircraft engines and ammunition. It included a table with the meagre production of tanks, artillery and ammunition that could be expected in the following 3 months. Hitler did not answer directly, but on March 19th, 1945, 2 months later, he signed the Nero Decree. All industrial, transport and communications facilities on German territory had to be destroyed before they fell into enemy hands. Bridges, factories, power plants, gas depots, mines, everything. Speer spent the next few weeks frantically traveling to sabotage the execution of the decree. He convinced local military commanders, Gauleiters and company leaders to delay or ignore destruction orders. His argument, that the German people needed such infrastructure to survive after the war, was dangerously close to admitting defeat, exactly what Hitler had forbidden on pain of being considered a traitor. Speer's last documented meeting with Hitler was in the bunker of the Chancellery in Berlin at the end of April 1945. While outside, the Soviet artillery reduced the city centre to rubble. Hitler held situation conferences on fronts that no longer existed, moving phantom divisions on maps that no longer corresponded to any reality. What, in short, was the German war economy? Adam Tooze, in his analysis of the arms cycle of the Third Reich, comes to a conclusion that inverts the dominant myth. The German war machine was not the expression of an impregnable economy. It was, from the outset, the desperate attempt of a country relatively poor in natural resources and capital to compete with powers that surpassed it in almost all relevant economic metrics. In 1933, Germany's per capita income was comparable to that of other upper-middle European countries, but lower than that of Britain, France, and by far the United States. The industrial base was strong in specific sectors: chemicals, optics, precision machinery, electrical engineering, but access to critical raw materials depended on imports that an aggressive foreign policy could cut off at any time. What Nazism did was to concentrate a historically unheard-of proportion of national resources in armaments, resorting to Schacht's invented financing, coercion on private industry, systematized theft of resources in the occupied territories, and, finally, the industrial-scale enslavement of millions of human beings. The Allies' combined output, measured in tons of steel, barrels of oil, number of aircraft, naval tonnage, outpaced Germany in every category from the first year of the war. In 1942, according to calculations in the archives of the Nuremberg Tribunal, the Soviet Union alone produced more armaments than Germany, at a time when the Reich occupied the most industrialized regions of Soviet territory. In 1943 and 1944, the gap between Allied and German production became insurmountable. The war machine that for years seemed invincible was, from within, an operation of patches, tensions, bottlenecks and contradictions that could only work as long as the enemies were slow to react. When they reacted, the system showed its cracks irreversibly. Behind the numbers and organizational charts, there were specific people making decisions under specific conditions. Hjalmar Schacht, the banker who invented fictitious money to finance rearmament, ended up arrested by the Gestapo in 1944 after the attack of July 20th, although he had no direct relationship with the conspirators. He was imprisoned in Dachau and then in Flossenburg. At Nuremberg, he was acquitted. Erhard Milch, the Secretary of State who built the Luftwaffe, was sentenced to life imprisonment for the use of slave labor in the aircraft industry. The sentence was later commuted. Walter Dornberger, the colonel who led the rocket program at Peenemünde, emigrated to the United States after the war and worked for Bell Aerospace. Werner von Braun, the young engineer Speer, described as someone for whom the V-2 was a step into the future of technology, became the father of the American space program and designed the Saturn V rocket that carried Apollo astronauts to the moon. Fritz Sauckel was hanged in Nuremberg on October 16, 1946. Albert Speer served 20 years in prison in Spandau. He was released in 1966. He died in London in 1981 while giving an interview to the BBC. His memoirs, Der Sklavenarbeiter des Dritten Reiches, published in German in 1969, are one of the most cited documents on the inner workings of the regime, and also one of the most questioned, because Speer was a master in the art of managing his own historical image. Hugo Junkers, the aviation pioneer whose company was confiscated at gunpoint in 1933, died on February 3, 1935, the day of his 75th birthday, never having regained control of what he built. Speer's rationalization increased German armament production by real proportions. The production index tripled in value between 1942 and the summer of 1944. But the increase came too late and hit limits that no organizational reform could overcome. The first was that of raw materials. Germany never had sufficient access to oil. The Romanian fields of Ploiești, which the Allies began systematically bombing in 1943, and the synthetic fuel from the plants in the interior were the only mattresses available. When those plants began to be destroyed in 1944, the system came to a standstill. The second limit was labor. As the Eastern Front absorbed millions of soldiers, the civilian economy was left without skilled workers. Sokol could bring in any Ukrainian or Pole to push a wheelbarrow, but making an aircraft engine or calibrating the guidance systems of a projectile required years of technical training that could not be replaced with slave labor. The third was transportation. The Reichsbahn was at the limit of its capacity even before the war. As the Reich expanded and the fronts multiplied, the railway network became the central bottleneck of the entire economy. Each carriage had too many possible destinations and too little time to reach them all. The fourth, and perhaps the deepest, was structural. The Nazi economy was a system in which political decision could modify priorities from one day to the next. Today, the U-boats, tomorrow the army, after the rockets, without anybody having sufficient authority to impose coherence. Hitler was the final arbiter of everything, and Hitler made decisions about armaments in the same intuitive style as he made operational ones, based on intuition, aesthetic preferences, and a desire to believe that technology could compensate for the strategic disadvantage. The documents presented at the Nuremberg trial, especially the archives of the Ministry of Armaments and the minutes of the conferences between Hitler and his economic ministers, show a system in which information flowed upwards, warped by fear, and decisions descended distorted by ideology. No one wanted to be the messenger of bad news. In January 1945, Hitler forbade in one of his situation conferences that anyone should say that the war was lost. Whoever did so would be treated as a traitor, with consequences for him and his family. In the first months of 1945, the production lines were still operating, although with diminishing capacities. Factory workers, Germans, forced laborers from the East, prisoners of war, continued to assemble tanks and planes in facilities that Allied bombers had reduced to half-destroyed structures covered with tarpaulins to protect them from the rain. In the Mittelwerk, under the Harz Mountains, the prisoners of the Mittelbau-Dora camp continued to assemble V2s in the tunnels they had dug themselves. The concrete walls of the tunnels absorbed the noise of the jackhammers. The air was cold and damp. In the corners, the bodies of those who had not survived exhaustion and starvation were waiting to be removed. In Kassel, Henschel's factories continued to produce Tigers until the tanks of General Patton's Third Army arrived on the outskirts of the city in April 1945. In Essen, the blast furnaces at Krupp were still burning when the American troops crossed the Rhine. The TOT organization, the same organization that had built the Atlantic Wall and the U-boat bunkers at Lorient, Brest and Saint-Nazaire, attempted to demolish the Rhine bridges before the Allies could cross them. In some places it was successful. On the Remagen Bridge on March 7, 1945, the explosives failed and soldiers from the US 9th Armored Corps crossed to the other side before anyone could stop them. The Reich ended as it began, with traps, improvisations, and the abyss between what the regime promised and what reality allowed. The Nuremberg trials did not judge only individuals, they judged a system. IG Farben was disbanded by order of the Allies. Its executives were prosecuted in the IG Farben trial in 1947 to 1948. Several were convicted of crimes against humanity related to slave labor at Auschwitz. The company was divided into several successor companies, including Bayer, BASF, and Höchst. Krupp, the family that had made the steel for 2 world wars, was also on trial. Alfred Krupp was sentenced to 12 years. He regained control of his companies in 1951 after an amnesty by the US High Commissioner John J. McCloy that scandalized many observers. The synthetic fuel plants at Leuna, Hydrowerk Pölitz and Ruhröl were partially dismantled by the Soviets as war reparations. The Mittelwerk tunnels remained sealed for decades. Historical research into the working conditions of the Mittelbau-Dora prisoners intensified from the 1980s and 1990s onwards. The site is today a memorial and museum that receives tens of thousands of visitors a year. Werner von Braun arrived at Fort Bliss, Texas, in September 1945, along with more than 100 German scientists under Operation Paperclip. He worked for the American Army and then for NASA. In 1969, the Saturn V he designed put Neil Armstrong on the moon. He was never tried for his role in the V2 program or for the conditions in which the rockets were manufactured. The German war machine was ultimately the work of thousands of people who were convinced or forced to believe that their individual tasks had meaning within a larger project. The engineers who designed the rockets, the workers who welded the armored vehicles, the accountants who signed the forced labor contracts, the officials who organized the rail transports that brought as much ammunition to the front as Jews to the death camps, the same network, the same machinery. Within the Third Reich, the differences between a ministry and a concentration camp, between an armaments factory and a mass murder facility were differences of function but not of system. The train carrying bearings to the aircraft factories and the train carrying deportees to Treblinka left the same switchyards, ran on the same tracks, were managed by the same Reichsbahn officials. That is what it means to understand the German war machine from the inside.